afternoon, and good day to you. This is Brandon Tilt here, and you're tuned into Feather of Light. This is a podcast where I like to give you a bit of perspective on mental health or philosophy or maybe just wellness in general. And today I'd like to talk to you about the topic of shame. And I'm going to be drawing from some of Brene Brown's definitions in her book, Atlas of the Heart, as well as referencing some information I learned more recently about shame from this shame workshop that I attended. So let's just jump on in with, we've all experienced shame at some point in our lives, whether it was our childhood or maybe 5 or 10 years ago and it feels like a distant memory. Or if it's something that we do work with, it's more likely we'll notice that it's a continual, ongoing re-experiencing of sometimes a traumatic event in the past, or it can be related to the present moment and people in our lives that, let's just say, aren't emotionally safe and might be actually abusive. So shame can be a continual current event, but many times our overwhelming experience of shame that we're bottling up and not sitting with is tied to a past event, sometime where we felt like that event defined us and told us that we are no good, that we're not worthy of love or we don't belong. So just to define shame just a little bit, right? Just to broaden this topic. Brene Brown goes on to talk about shame in her book by first saying where there's a difference between shame, which she defines as I am bad, right? You're telling yourself on a deeper level, you are the problem, versus guilt, which is the experience of feeling that I did something bad, right? So pretty big difference there. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad. And she goes on to even define humiliation as another extension of this topic. I've been belittled and put down by someone. This left me feeling unworthy of connection and disgusted with myself. So this is how she defines humiliation. And lastly, she defines embarrassment as I did something that made me uncomfortable, but I know I'm not alone. Everyone does these kinds of things. Embarrassment is fleeting. Sometimes it's even funny. So there's just a bit of a clarity there with shame being, let's just say it's the most intimate, sharpest edge there. I am bad. There's nothing to it. It's very rigid. And guilt is starting to recognize there's something that you did that means, well, something that you did that you define as bad. And then humiliation is that you've been belittled and it hurts. And this has left you feeling unworthy of connection and like you don't belong and even disgusted with yourself. And then, of course, embarrassment. It's kind of this more acceptable version where we're aware that it's not exactly going to be internalized in the same way that shame would be. She goes on to quote Antoine Quentin Fisher. It's a book called Finding Fish. I think this quote here is important, so I'm just going to sort of lay it out there. It's a bit of a hanging quote, right? It's just sort of left out there for you to maybe define, if you will. I hated the internal wounds. The words that said I was worthless and unwanted. The teasing, the ridicule that echoed in my ears and shattered my insides into dust. If given the choice, I'd have picked a beating over being shamed. So I feel it's important that we make this, I would say, relatable in a way, and I feel that quote is doing that very well. We talk about this this experience, and we try to define it, but realistically, it's important that we're not triggering shame just by talking about shame like it's this thing that I'm objectively looking at from over here, like, oh no, that's such a horrible experience and you're in that. That's kind of like sympathy versus like a genuine empathic understanding that, oh, we all experience shame, and let's just get a little bit more curious about what that experience is like for each of us. Honestly, to take a pause on Brene Brown, just draw from my personal experience, I've been working with shame a lot. In fact, this last kind of year and a half in my therapy, it's been a challenging topic that I've built up towards working through. So it's not like I just started with the idea that we're going to work with shame today, but over time, I started to realize that I'd been forming all these protector parts, you know, as I see in parts work. I had initially formed them as a way to keep me safe, right? Keep me kind of at a distance from others, right? Keeping walls around my most vulnerable parts of me. Don't want everybody to see me that way. That causes shame, for me at least, and most people. So when I was in therapy, I still sometimes do this, right? Depending if I trust the therapist, there's a part that comes out that let's just call therapy part, right? And it's a protector part, and it's very effective at kind of dancing around, sometimes just running away from whatever topics I feel the most deep-rooted shame around, whatever topics are the real scary thing that make me feel very uncomfortable, and on some level make me feel like I can't trust the person in front of me. You know, I don't know if they're going to judge me or see me as less than because of what I'm sharing. So yeah, I mean, I still share very vulnerably, but these protector parts often unconsciously kind of just redirect the conversation away from the really scary stuff. And I would say it's to avoid feeling shame, or even going into the belief systems that shame has kind of constructed as a way to preserve those parts and keep me away from the pain. So without going too deep into parts work, let's just say they're protector parts, and then there are more vulnerable parts called exiles. And they're often the ones who hold on to shame. And your internal system is so aware of how, I guess, wounding and painful that shame can be, and the impact of it on the internal system, that it keeps it kind of quarantined in a way. It keeps it locked away and forms all these belief systems and all these protector parts that are really good at keeping you away from the shame. You're playing how's that game go when you're just throwing the ball? Keep away. It's kind of like all these protector parts are playing keep away with your conscious awareness so that you're not landing on the topic of shame. So I think you get it. It's something I've tried to work with for a long time, and I've felt each time it surfaces, it really drains me. You know, I feel like a lot of it relates to my teen years or sometimes my childhood, right? Times where I felt ostracized or alone, or as a teen, I felt like I was kind of a troubled youth. So a lot of the things that I did, a lot of the ways that I sort of viewed the world, I think are outdated and through the lens of these shame parts or these belief systems that were rooted in shame. And I look back and I don't even want to think about who I was or how I showed up. It's often too uncomfortable, and I feel so disconnected from that part of me that I on some level still am, but it's so much easier, and I'm so much quicker to judge this part of me that I view as the shameful part, the one that's the root of whatever, you know, abusive behaviors, maybe misogyny that's internalized, maybe the root of where my drug use kind of got out of control and where I had to escape from my emotions. Another one that comes up for, I'd say, a lot of men, to be honest, is not feeling my emotions really deeply and fully, and really avoiding sadness and not feeling like I could cry for most of my life. It's just, the amount of shame that I held on to just with that idea, with just even speaking those words, I feel like I'm disengaging from that a little bit right now in my body. Like I'm sort of subtly disassociating. So I'm just going to call myself back into presence. Really slowing down with my words and really honoring the parts of me that have let me talk to this today and know the safety is there and the work has been done. And just honoring any protector parts that feel like they want to disengage with this topic and this feeling of not being enough. And introducing a little bit more curiosity and love. Noticing if these parts want to share more. And letting them know that right now we're trying to speak generally to the topic of shame. So getting into the parts work, doing a deep dive isn't really what I can do right now. But if there's something I can offer, even just this check-in, this reassurance, I'd like to offer any parts that feel called to receive that, some reassurance and some recognition and some love. And maybe a promise that I'll return to this a little bit later and do a bit more deep of a check-in. And just noticed that I talked about shame today and it brought up some stuff in my body. It activated some parts and that's okay. I can hold that and I feel safe in that. So to continue this discussion from Brene Brown's perspective, she speaks to a lot of examples. She almost just wants to clarify shame is in all of us. And here are some examples shared by research participants from her study on shame. So shame is hiding the fact that I'm in recovery. This is an example from research. Shame is raging at my kids. Shame is bankruptcy. Shame is getting laid off and having to tell my pregnant wife. Shame is my boss calling me an idiot in front of the client. Shame is not making partner. Shame is my husband leaving me for my next door neighbor. Shame is my partner asking me for a divorce and telling me that she wants children, but not with me. Shame is my DUI. Shame is infertility. Shame is telling my fiance that my dad lives in France, when in fact, he's in prison. Shame is internet porn. Shame is flunking out of school twice. Shame is hearing my parents fight through the walls and wondering if I'm the only one who feels afraid. Wow. Some of those really hit home. I'm sure for myself, but I'm sure for others as well, just listening to the podcast and hearing about these examples. But, each of us holds on to shame in some shape or form. And I just really want to make that as clear as possible. So just to maybe end the exploration of some of Brene Brown's book here in her section on shame, I just want to mention how there's something here about self-compassion and how important self-compassion is when you're moving through shame. So that's one piece. And also how perfectionism, it's this function of shame. It's something bred from the experience of shame. So I guess just to turn that back to the listener, how much self-compassion are you able to show yourself when you're experiencing something that thrusts you into an experience of shame? And additionally, are you a perfectionist? I don't even know if that's a question. I think most of us are. And if you can own it, is there a way that you can tie that, let's just call it perfectionistic quality or trait or even part of you back to a certain point of your life where maybe you felt shame? And there's a way that this part's like never again, never again. And then you start to strive for this perfectionistic ideal, which is next to impossible to really fully meet. Anyway, I really appreciate Brene Brown's perspective. going to put it down so I can try to get more into some of the stuff I learned in this workshop, because it was amazing. This workshop, it was put on by Tatra de la Rosa, and she is a clinical supervisor whom has been counseling for a very long time, and she trains people how to essentially heal, hold space for, support people in shame. So she teaches other counselors how to work with shame. And she went through her training through some institution in the States, some Ivy League, I don't know, Berkeley or somewhere, but somewhere where she got some great training, and then she created a system on her own. And my attending of this workshop was just an introduction to her and her method, and I learned a lot. So I'm going to maybe just quickly reference a few things from her workshop. So we feel shame in the body and believe this story that it tells, right? If you've learned anything about parts work and exiles, there's this idea that the shame we experience, the exile's pain, it really just needs to tell its story. It really needs to feel safe so that it can start telling the story. And then over time, you begin to recognize that the story that this part tells you, and it tells you about the world, about the nature of people, the nature of right and wrong, who knows, right? It's usually specific to you, but it isn't true. But it's important to recognize that that story is actually a life-saving solution that an infant version of you, very likely an infant, came up with. You came up with a solution. You're like, you know what? Here's how it all makes sense. And you're trying to solve what's most likely an unsolvable dilemma. It's such an impossible thing for you to figure out. So you're just trying to do your best to come up with this life-saving solution. And this is why she calls it, Tatra de la Rosa, she calls it the shame solution. So you consider, looking back, there's this moment where you came up with this shame solution. And it's genuinely a misunderstanding about the world. It is. It's this thing that you felt was encompassing reality, but it's more likely it was encompassing society, or it can be connected to your friend circle, your close-knit circle, or it can be related to your family level, where there's more of a connection to attachment, right? So it's precognitive at this point. It's implicit. It's stored within the body and the nervous system of your parents, and then it goes on to become implicitly stored within the nervous system. So just to say that again, there's this attachment, there's this connection between shame and attachment. When we were infants, our parents showed up in ways that we couldn't consciously recognize. It's what's called an implicitly stored memory. So our nervous system picks it up. Our nervous system is fully receptive to this information. But even if our parents are telling us, I love you, I care about you, you're the most important thing to me in the world, if their nervous system is saying something different, that is what gets stored within the body. It gets stored deeply within the fascia, the muscles, the skin tissues, and the bones. And that encodes belief systems about the world. And according to Tatra de la Rosa, in her understanding of shame, the need to belong is where this starts. When we're an infant, we just have this inherent need to belong, to be loved and cared for. And when this need to belong is unmet, shame emerges as a way to help us feel connected. It starts to kind of shift things around to rewrite the narrative in a way where, oh, if the world, so if the problem is now me, then there's hope. I can do something about this. And maybe if the world's like this, then I can get my needs met then. Yeah, it's just a solution to a complicated, often unsolvable problem. And I can't go through every point of her workshop. It feels like I'd be getting a little bit in the weeds and folks might not follow. But let's just say the shame beliefs are the internal responses, because the attachment need, is what happened outside, right? It happened outside of the body in relation to other. There was an attachment need, like for instance, I said the need to belong. And that was the outside world's response. That was the outside world telling you something. But then the shame is what our body implicitly codes, and it becomes the internal response to that attachment need not being met. For example, when parents aren't emotionally attuned to their child, there isn't safety. And as a result of that lack of safety, shame forms because there is nobody there to receive the child and their emotions, to attune to their cries for support or whatever, right? So I just want to check in with whomever's listening, whatever's going on in your life, however you're feeling right now. I'd like you to check in with your body. Now, why? That's not obvious already. Shame is a sticky or contagious emotion. So when shame is present in the space, it's likely to trigger shame in others. So I'm maybe not talking about my personal, most intimate, vulnerable experiences of shame, but when this topic comes up, there can be a tightening of the boundaries. There can be more of a rigidness introduced. You might personally feel called to just turn off the podcast, and maybe there's a way to which it's just not, this doesn't land, and I honor that. I really do. I feel like that is a natural response. But if you're open and you're available and you're creating emotional safety within your body, and maybe you've worked with shame before, I feel like it's incredibly valuable to start to understand how shame has operated historically so that you can begin to introduce awareness to, let's just say, what belief system or what bodily reactions might be outdated. So I'm noticing I'm getting around the 20-minute mark, and I'd like to kind of wrap up this topic of shame, maybe have some closing shares just about my personal experience of healing shame. But before I do, there's a couple other points I want to just sort of touch on briefly that were from the workshop. So firstly, the freeze state of shame. If we look at shame, it's typically a freeze response. And it's typically a freeze response because there is a part of us that gets stuck. It feels helpless, and there is an inability for compassion to get in from outside sources or even from ourselves. Our, let's just say, affirmations of love and self-love, our ability to show up compassionately for ourselves and engage in self-care, that might not get through to the deeper core level where that exile part feels like it's most deeply wounded. For instance, if you go to therapy and someone's telling you something that your inner child probably needs to hear, you might not be ready to hear it. And if your shameful part, your exile is stuck in some response and it's frozen in an ice cube, those words aren't getting in. Sometimes painting is a beautiful way that you can start to show that love and feel something different and introduce a different approach to working with that shame that doesn't necessarily require those words, but it still, I would say, engages the nervous system, and it allows you to work with the shame without having to, let's just say, plow past these protector parts that are not going to let you through. So it's kind of a way that you're safely introducing a kind of titration, as it's referred to in somatic therapy. You're touching a little piece, and you're opening up and supporting a little piece of the shame versus going in and opening the floodgates. So that's kind of an important piece to recognize, is that we don't want to go too much too fast. And sometimes something like art therapy or dance or other expression tools that I've mentioned in previous episodes of my podcast, they're good ways you can start to introduce more awareness and offer maybe a deeper, more wounded part of you a chance to feel into just a little bit of that pain without it becoming a deep dive that starts to activate all these other parts and starts to create a lot more turbulence for a part that might not be able to handle that. I guess a quick side tangent. I feel like that's one of the reasons plant medicine journeys can be such a, lack of a better word, crapshoot. It's that sometimes there is a vulnerable part within you that needs to be healed. But if you're going into a container that you don't necessarily know can hold you within that vulnerability, yeah, it can be very challenging for that part, and it can be very problematic for those protector parts, and it can actually trigger defensive or fear-based responses. And I've experienced that, honestly. I've experienced that in plant medicine ceremonies. I've experienced it while taking mushrooms and going for walks to the forest. I've experienced it taking acid. You know, it just feels like those experiences have helped me in different ways, for sure, trial by fire. But had I had the foresight, let's just say, to create safety and titrate and have a setting in place and some degree of preparation, something that I needed, let's just say, I don't feel like I would have had to have done the cleanup work afterwards to kind of compensate for the additional pain. Some could even say the re-traumatization in some shape or form of the body and nervous system that I would say could be avoided if you honor these parts of you, the protector parts, the exile parts, the ones that hold on to shame, the ones that protect from shame. You just honor these parts. So it's just a side note, is if you're doing plant medicine, think about it like your most vulnerable part of you is being reintroduced to some degree of safety. And you just have to consider what kind of safety is being reintroduced to, whether that's through others, whether that's through your own internal experience and the energy that you hold. So, lastly, she talks about Tatra de la Rosa. She refers to, there's this idea that there's these shame protector parts. What do the shame protector parts do? Well, as I said in the beginning of the podcast episode, they distract from the shame. And if you stay focused on the problems that these protectors develop, well, it takes the focus off of this wounded, vulnerable part. And it's more likely that when you're going to, say, therapy, that these therapists, counselors, psychologists, whatever practitioner, right, they're most likely dealing with the presenting issues that are the result of the shame protectors versus the actual deeper, wounded, vulnerable parts. And I guess that is just such an interesting recognition from someone in a counseling background, who's someone who does parts work. You need to recognize that these issues are actually designed to keep us away from the shame state for good reason. And to, quote unquote, cure things, to solve the problem, to completely eradicate these coping mechanisms that are actually designed to keep us out of the most painful experiences, we're actually revealing something that we're not necessarily ready to reveal. So I just almost just want to say, like, some therapy modalities might just want to fully remove the coping mechanism, and that can be of benefit on a surface level. But the result that might have on the internal system, now that you're bypassing protectors or you're removing their version of keeping safety in check, you're removing that, you're not considering the consequences or the results that might have on the internal system and the whole harmony of the system. It's like you remove that last layer of defense. How is the whole system going to respond to try to create safety? I'm trying to think of a better metaphor. You know, maybe what do you do when, you know, you're let's just say you're in a fight with something that has a sword, and now you've removed the sword. It's more likely that maybe they're less dangerous in some way, but it's more likely that the thing that no longer has this thing that was its main source of protection is now just going to become more erratic and more panicky and maybe more desperate to keep itself safe, right? So you can almost imagine if our protector parts have this thing that's like their sword, and we're saying, no, you don't get to fight with the sword anymore. Put that shit down. In fact, I'm taking that from you. It's kind of like the protector part's kind of like, oh, well, I got stuff to protect over here. I don't use my sword. Well, I'm going to use everything I know how to keep me safe, the vulnerable thing it's protecting safe. And the result of that might be actually more dangerous if you think about it. Anyway, that's just a interesting metaphor. I'm not in a lot of fights. I don't do sword fights, but that's just a way of considering how sometimes solving a problem and trying to cure something is actually causing the internal system more havoc. And there might be a different approach that you can go in with that supports the protector part, that supports the exiles, that helps create balance and harmony within the whole system versus just trying to go for solving one particular aspect of it. So I feel like this is probably good for the most part. I feel like I've been healing a lot of my own shame, and the result of that is really quite amazing. When you go into your shame, when you go into heal the most vulnerable parts of you, and you do it safely, and you're able to really work with the body versus against the body, you unlock so much joy. You unlock so much creative energy. You unlock so much capacity for love. And no, it's not like you turn on, you open the floodgate and all of a sudden it's just pouring out continually and it never stops. That sounds unrealistic, and I should say it really very much is. So it starts to gradually surface. You start to gradually notice more opportunities to engage with yourself just a little bit differently, maybe more spaciousness. And maybe you're starting to notice that the shame response isn't coming in as sharply, and you can feel more empathic towards others because you don't view them through the lens of that belief system that is rooted in shame. And you can gradually start to introduce more love to others. This kind of reminds me of a quote by Carl Jung. I shared it on my Instagram, so I can't remember it perfectly, but if you want to check it out. Something about where we have to heal our personal shadow first. That is the first thing we are required to do before we're able to really experience and sit with and I'd say be fully aware of the collective shadow. Because when we're stuck in our personal shadow's veil or belief systems, we're not able to really fully hold space for and have a degree of openness for how the collective shadow operates, how the world operates. We're just stuck. We're still stuck in that outdated belief. So once we work with our personal shadow, once we do the inner work, once we let the tension from our bodies start to loosen and flow, we allow in different energy, and that energy can start to inform us about how the collective shadow ought to be healed and eventually resolved and unburdened. So I hope you've taken away a piece of understanding around shame. Maybe you have a little bit more compassion for these parts of you that show up and try to protect you from shame, or the ones that are stuck in that shame, and there's an openness to turn towards them with love. And whatever it is you do, I hope you're able to recognize that it's not a race. Healing isn't a competition. It's really just showing up each day, showing up for ourselves, our parts, differently each day, and turning towards love, turning towards maybe more of a gentleness within the body and a level of embodied presence. So I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining me today. And take care for now. I need more guests. So if you feel like you'd be a good guest, reach out. Otherwise, I would really appreciate if you give me a 5-star review. Just leave a comment, something like that. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, please reach out over Instagram, Facebook, or through my email, featheroflightcounseling@outlook.com. I have available slots for counseling. Additionally, I have parts workshops that I'm running each week. So Saturdays at 10 a.m. we'll be meeting this week and each week following, where we can bring in discussions around parts. You can share about things that you're noticing about your parts, and I will offer some education around working with your parts. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care. Bye.